We're now recording, everyone. And Arthur, would you mind doing
All right,
the
well,
opening?
we'll officially start the meeting.
Yay! Welcome, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone.
Hey.
My name is Melanie Bennett. I am a producer on the film The World is My Country and facilitator on the World is My Country Club, working together towards a people-powered planet. So let me tell you how the meeting works. We are going to first, I will introduce Arthur, who will introduce our special guest today. And afterwards, we'll have discussion and questions and things like that. But in the meantime, while everyone else is talking, everyone should know where their mute button is. So you go down to the bottom.
Right.
And you can mute yourself. So when other people are talking, everyone should be muted. And then afterwards, we will have, you can raise your hands either physically, and I'll try to catch you. But it's even better if you try doing the hand raising mechanism that Zoom has. Let's all try to raise our hands. What you do is go down to the bottom and click on participant. You'll see the hand raising. Can everyone try to raise their hands? Tom, everybody try to. Jerry's got it. Yes. So Janet, are you able to? Does that Lee? I see Lee's here today. Great. Yeah. So it's basically at the bottom. We'll give you some time to look at that, and you can also use the chat and connect with me if you have any problems. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to, and everyone, I'd like to introduce our wonderful host, the director of the film The World is My Country, our host at the club, Mr. Arthur Kanegis. Take it away.
Well, thank you.
Yay.
Thank you so much. And we're very pleased to have a number of wonderful guests with us, including, just stepping out of the picture there was my wife, Molly Post, who's known Hazel for, decades and decades.
Yes, hi, Molly.
And we're very glad to have Jerry, who's head to local Citizens for Global Solutions, and Marty and Shirley, lots of wonderful people here on the call. And I know, I think there's some more. There's someone from Germany, from England who's about to join us. And here's Jane, welcome. Wayne, who do we have at the 828-318 number? You can unmute yourself a second and introduce yourself.
This is Tim Barton.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, Jim has been a very active global citizen for many years, great researcher, and worked very actively with the Citizens for Global Solutions in Washington, D.C., right? And also in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, great to have you with us, and looking forward to having you join us as we begin to build the people-powered planet. Now, the whole purpose of our club here is that, as you know, Melanie and I made a movie called The World is My Country. And in it, Gary told his amazing story of his adventures as a world citizen. And he gave a prescription at the end for, a way out of this mess we're in, how we could create what he called a people-powered planet. Einstein said that he was the guy with the key to whether humans continue to live on this planet or whether we do ourselves in. So it's probably worth listening to Gary, and we did. and we started this club to begin to talk with wonderful individuals and begin to develop how do we actually implement the people-powered planet he mentioned? How do we get ourselves off this? How do we save the world in a hurry? How do we get ourselves off the path of doom and self-destruction that's been created out of the nation-state system and evolve beyond that to a more powerful, better way that we, the citizens, can begin to govern our world. So with that, I would like to introduce our very special guest, Hazel Henderson. Hazel is an evolutionary economist, and she's the author of some wonderful books like the creating alternative futures, the end of economics, the end of economics. Wow. Yeah. She's also done ethical markets, growing the green economy, and also planetary citizenship. So she's a perfect guest for us to begin to ask the key question, as we begin to do what Gary said, as we begin to work on evolving and developing the people-powered planet, we've obviously got some very broken things in the current economic system. And perhaps Hazel has some solutions to offer us for how from a bottom-up citizens standpoint, we can begin to create a new economy in our world, a better way to incentivize doing good in the world rather than bad. One of the other things that Hazel did is she said the GDP is the gross national product. Actually, this gross national pollution and destroying the world, and talking about an alternative index. Maybe we could start with Hazel telling us a little bit about her alternative index and who she partnered with to create this.
Well, thank you, Arthur. And, to me, Gary Davis is kind of the quintessential global planetary citizen. And what an amazing film that you guys created. It's just incredible. I just loved every minute of it. So, yeah, very early in the game, when I first came to this country from Britain, I became a citizen of the US in 1963 and started a group called Citizens for Clean Air, because I realized that the air in New York City was just as bad as it had been in London, which caused 4,000 excess deaths in 1 week back in the 1960s. And so I had never went to college. And so basically, even though I ended up with 4 honorary degrees, I never had to waste any time in college, and I never had to go into student debt or anything like that, And I learned very much by being an environmental activist. And I knew enough, even back then in the 60s when I started Citizens for Clean Air, that somehow or other, the GDP didn't include all the bads that came along with the goods. And the bads, of course, being pollution and all of the messes that we see around us. And so part of the program of our group, and we had block captains in every borough of the city of New York, and I had found an ad agency to do a free campaign for us about air pollution. And basically, we realized that something in our program had to refer to the fact that the GDP was going to be steering us over the cliff unless it subtracted all of the bads from the goods, And so that became quite a theme in my life. And many, many years later, after I'd been a policy wonk in Washington for 6 years and seen the whole thing up front, and all the lobbying that fossil fuels companies were doing to keep polluting the air and all of that kind of thing. I realized I became an advisor to one of the first mutual funds that screened out polluting companies and companies that manufactured weapons and had bad records on employee rights and all of those things. And so I persuaded them to do an alternative to GDP with me, which we called the Hazel Henderson Quality of Life Indicators. And instead of having it all bunched up in one number and all measured by money, we decided that that was really stupid. And what you should also do is unbundle all of these indicators that were important, like air pollution and health and education and all of the other things that were important. And we should use the proper scientific metric for each one. And there was nothing about money. And that's all GDP is, as you know. It's just a cash flow kind of indicator. And you lose all of the important detail. So our indicators were 12, and every time we were looking at whatever it was, we picked the right scientific indicator. So for pollution, air pollution, naturally, we had parts per million of junk in the air. You know, nothing to do with money. You know, even though the economists would say, oh, well, we can measure the pollution by saying how costly it is to launder shirts. And everything, see, that's the fallacy of economists. They're so hypnotized by money. And as we know, money has nothing to do with wealth. It's not wealth at all, doesn't measure wealth. All the money does is track and keep score of the human interactions with the real wealth of nature and our own wealth in terms of our talents and creativity. So anyway, now fast forward, what happened by 2007, I was invited by the European Commission to be on an organizing committee they had for a conference they were putting together for the European Parliament and all of the member countries called Beyond GDP. And so what we decided to do then, by that time, I had started this company because it's an alternative media company that's run out of my garage here. Like all good media companies on the internet, you know, you don't need a big office or anything like that. And so we decided that we would do a survey with the best global public opinion company called GlobeScan. And we said, okay, we'll do a survey of how ordinary people in 12 different countries, north, south, east, and west, if they understood, as we had so many years before, that GDP measured in money didn't tell us anything about real progress. So we did the first survey, and we found in all 12 countries that the ordinary citizens, by huge majority, 78, 82%, all agreed that GDP had to be expanded to include real indicators in education, health, the environment, and all of that.
Now,
So
how did that end up getting used by an investment company, Calvert Investment? Did that attract a lot of investors into the alternative?
So I took the Calvert Henderson quality of life indicators, and we had a little booth there at the European Commission, along with all the other people around the world who had alternative indicators. But the economists had always pushed those people into the basement, you know, and their indicators of health and education using real science and real metrics were overcome really by all of the reigning fashion, which is everything has to be turned into money so that we can have the economists on top. And that's one of the big problems we've had and helped create the mess we're in right now. And that's why
what I'd like to focus on a little more is how I mean, so many of us are aware that the current economy is pretty screwed up, the GDP and so on. And in our limited time, I'd like to dwell more on solutions. So we consider this kind of a solutionary program. So what do we see as the things that we can do to actually begin to change that? How do you visualize a new economy, say what Gary would call people-powered economy?
Really, that's why I was just about to shift to the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They were all developed grassroots. And those 17 goals really are the very opposite of the GDP. And I like to say that the GDP incentivizes the 7 deadly sins, count them, you know, greed, acquisitiveness, competition, envy, you name it. And the SDGs, which take us to a much more indigenous and systemic kind of ethical behavior that we all know, and that is the golden rule. And so that's where we are now, that I'm thrilled that the UN, for the first time, the UN began to really understand media And they've put a tremendous amount of effort into public relations and marketing and advertising and getting those sustainable development goals adopted all over the world, so that now even companies are adopting them. So what we've done over the past decade at Ethical Markets Media is we've been tracking all of the private investments in green technologies and the kind of technologies that fit into the future of the SDGs, you know, electric cars and green energy, solar, wind, the circular economy, just like nature has it, you know, where you don't have any kind of waste. Everything gets recycled and reused. And so there's a lot of different things going on now. And I just posted something very encouraging this morning in our latest headlines, which you can sign up for free. And this is a speech by a woman who's, guess what, in charge of climate for the Bank of England. And she's making a speech to a whole lot of bankers and financial people and saying, okay, we at the Bank of England are going to reveal all of our climate risks in, you know, when they do quantitative easing and they buy up all those dud mortgages the way they did to get us out of the last financial crisis. Now they're going to disclose all of the financial risks in the asset side, and that's going to be incredible, because it will mean that they'll have to throw out all those fossil fuel companies. And if they do what they call quantitative easing, which is buying up all of these assets onto their balance sheet, they'll have to buy up electric car companies, and they'll have to buy up companies that are in recycling and upcycling waste, you see? And so this could be a huge, huge multiplier.
Wonderful.
And 66 central banks, get this, around the world have now signed up to the network for greening finance. 66 of the world's biggest central banks. So it's happening quickly.
Great, wonderful. Well, I think, okay, so clearly what you're doing is a key part of the equation, which is to begin to show them that it's actually in their long-term economic interest, even within the current financial system, to actually factor in the key factor of the Sustainable Development Goals and the survival of humanity. But moreover, beyond that, it seems like there's some central distortions in the current economic system, which is the fact that profit has to be the bottom line, even when it's destructive, and when people heading companies don't want to do certain bad things, they have to, or they get competed out of business and so on. How can some of these structural, how can we incentivize, you talked about a love economy, how do we incentivize the doing good, the sharing the positive, and how do we make that something that's even built into the core of the economic system so it doesn't have this downward spiral?
Yeah, well, it does begin with disclosure of the risks to the way we're operating now. And the risks we all know are not only climate change, but destruction by nuclear weapons, by pandemics. I mean, you know, this pandemic we're going through now is only one of a whole string of new ones, which will keep on emerging. You know, I did a paper on this with my friend, the physicist Fritjof Capra, you know, who wrote the Tao of Physics and all that. And we called it Pandemics, Lessons Looking Back from 2050. And we imagined ourselves as citizens in the year 2050. And we look at how the whole thing changed. And the whole thing changed, of course, was because the financial system, which really at the moment has been the flywheel of social and environmental destruction on the whole planet, suddenly we turned around the financial system by forcing them to account for the risks they were creating. And you know, so what happened, you know, is that ordinary investors began to sell their shares. And that's happening now. I don't know whether all of you noticed that, after the oil price dropped about a month ago into actual negative territory, the big oil companies all had to cut their dividends, and they lost a tremendous amount on their stock prices. Same thing that's happening to Facebook today and yesterday, where they refuse to act fast enough to take down all the hate and all of the sewage that's on their site. And so there's all of these big advertisers now withdrawing their ads from Facebook, and Facebook stock lost 8.5% of its value yesterday on the stock exchange. So the reason that we have focused on finance is because it's kind of at the top of the food chain in terms of everybody sort of believing that money is on top of everything. And even though that's entirely mythical and wrong, we now have to destroy that myth. And that's what I talked about with creating alternative futures, had to be the end of economics as kind of the neon god we created. You know, the people bowed and prayed to this neon god we made, the money. And so basically, you know, that's the way it's beginning to happen now.
So how do we then, how do you visualize in the alternative futures the kind of economy you would like to see on our planet? How would that look?
Well, as Fritjof Capra and I wrote in our scenario, which is on our website, basically everything goes much more local, and we forget about these great long globalization trends where everybody's shipping stuff around, and we go back to something which doesn't mean to say it's like completely going back to the past, because we have all the communications tools so that we can interact the way we are right now. But basically, it means that instead of shipping stuff around, which each country and each neighborhood and community knows how to produce itself for what it wants. And of course, that's why I've always supported local currencies, you know, where people can develop their own local economies. And so basically that is basically the model. And it's, instead of shipping around cars and all of this equipment and stuff and cakes and cookies and all of that, we ship around the recipes. Mm-hmm. For the green technologies. We share all of the best technology. And so it probably means very much less airline travel, much more with electric buses and trains, and very few people really needing to own electric cars, much more like electric bicycles, and that we get our streets back in the cities, so that people can use the streets again. They are open to pedestrians instead of traffic. This is the model in New York City now, you know, which started under Mayor Bloomberg, a young woman who used to play with my daughter when they were both at school together. She is heading up. She headed up the transportation system in the city of New York, brought in the bicycles, began to reclaim the city streets from cars. And so that's happening now in many cities. And of course, this means that we have cleaner air. And most of the goods and services will be produced and exchanged locally. Mm-hmm. Why not? So that's just one of the, I mean, I can't go into all of the details, but, you know.
Now, it seems to me one of the core things that happens in that in our economy that constantly has to grow is that we have to create ways of getting, of advertising and pushing people to waste. For example, you know, I have an old Vitamix that's, you know, maybe, I don't know, 40, 50 years old. It still runs, works fine. They used to make appliances that lasted for years, my Hamilton Beach mixer. And then they started calculating how they could create built-in obsolescence, so you sell more every year and so on.
Yes.
So that waste becomes sort of built into the system. How do we build into the system the advantages of sustainability and the advantages of things that serve humanity?
Well, there again, it's the incentive system, which we have to change from the old economy where everything has to be chewed up and turned into money. And once you take that away, and this is happening now with all of the circular economy ideas, which were developed by Ellen MacArthur, you know, the woman who sailed around the world by herself in a boat. And more and more now, there's 7.5 billion members of our human family, and resources are getting scarcer and more valuable than they used to be. And so now the incentives to make a living or to make profit, if you're a company, is to take those resources and reuse them and upcycle them. And I'm an advisor to a company called eCore, and you can go and look at what they do, but on their website, ecoreglobal.com, and they will take all of the waste from whatever operation it is, and on the right there in the plant, they will turn it into something useful the next day. For example, they are working with Heineken's beer in many countries. And the problem was, what do you do with the hops, the shells from the hops? So they gather up the shells right there every day and turn them into the cardboard six-packs for the next day's use. So, and that becomes the incentive model. You see that the resources now are too valuable to waste.
Right. Excellent. Well, now Gary created what he called the kilowatt dollar. He also was, as you talked about, into creating world money, a world currency that was based on. He based it on energy. He said, you know, energy is the thing that keeps everything flowing. Tell us, you know, what is money really? And when we understand what is money, how do we begin to create the alternative currencies that can actually, instead of suppressing us from getting what we need in our lives, you know, help us create what we need in our lives? It seems to be far more people want to give and help others and do things, and they're blocked from doing it because they can't get a job doing that. So they have to take a job doing something that's hurting people. They don't like it. They'd much rather be helping others and serving others. How can we build in the economy the ability to release people's fantastic passion to actually want to give their talents and help the world?
Well, Gary Davis was completely correct in understanding about money. And essentially, money is a social protocol that we all use. It's basically units of trust, either physical tokens of trust or paper or electronic tokens of trust. And we all know that trust doesn't really scale very, very far. Trust is what happens in face-to-face communities. And that's always been the problem with money. It somehow got loose into this globalized economy, and it had there's no trust involved with it anymore. And so we began to realize how false money is as a kind of a steering mechanism. Once we got into cryptocurrencies, and once everybody began to see that, like Bitcoin, which I always refer to as Bitcon, basically they're just vehicles for speculation. I have been involved for several years with a group based on Gary Davis's idea of money based on solar energy, solar electricity, because you can't mess around with it. You know, a kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour. And we call ourselves the Green Money Working Group. And one of the partners that we have on our website, if anyone wants to go to our partners page, you'll find all of these different groups that we love, that we think are doing excellent things. And there's one called Solar Coin. And this is you could call it a cryptocurrency, except what it really is a rewards currency. And you can't get a solar coin, which of course is a digital coin. You can't get it unless you can prove with a third party verifier that you have created so many kilowatt hours of solar electricity. Wow. For your roof or for your plant or your shopping center or whatever. And so that's really very much the kind of currency that Gary Davis had in mind.
Very good. Well, you know, there's a group called Global Citizen, and they've got top rock stars and so on, all putting on concerts. And the only way to get a ticket to that concert, you can't buy a ticket. You have to, you get points by doing things that serve your community, that do other things. You sign up, right, and you get points by being a good global citizen. And so I think that's kind of an example of what you're talking about.
Yes, very much so. And then, of course, all the local currencies that I've followed for years and years, and the ones that everybody knows the best, I think, are the ones that the Schumacher Society created 20 years ago, called Berkshires. And they circulate in the little town of Great Barrington in Massachusetts, and all of the banks accept them. And it means really that you have local currency, the Berkshires, in one pocket, and you have US dollars in the other pocket. And you only use the US dollars if you need something from outside the community. But otherwise, you use your Berkshires. And it's created a very robust local economy. And anyone that wants to look at it can just go to the Schumacher Society in Great Barrington and see how all of the businesses and the banks trade in Berkshires rather than US dollars.
Very interesting. Well, in a few moments, I want to try to open it to questions from other people. But before I do, you've mentioned Gary a couple of times. And tell me, what was your contact with Gary?
Well, I was just totally amazed. This was in the late 1970s, and I was on the board of the law school at the University of Florida. And I was doing a television program with their PBS station called, guess what, Creating Alternative Futures. And I had all kinds of friends of mine like Gene Houston come down there and do this television show with me. And one day the doorbell rang, and there was this guy that I had never met. And he introduced himself and came in, and we sat down and chatted, and he said, well, you know, I think you're kind of a global citizen. I said, well, yeah, I guess I've always felt like that, you know. And we had a general conversation, you know, about all of the issues which you've covered so beautifully in the film. You know, what an amazing guy. I think he must have been going to do a lecture at the University of Florida. I can't quite remember. But it was an amazing encounter. I was just, I mean, I understand now how incredibly valuable it was.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. Well, let me open the lines if anybody else has some questions. We can continue our discussion, but if anybody wants to either indicate by raising their hand physically or by going down to the participant button and clicking raise hands, either one works.
Jane has her hand up.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'm a systems ecologist by education, so I am very sympathetic to a lot of this stuff.
Wait, speak a little louder or a little closer to your computer. I'm having trouble hearing you.
I'm a systems ecologist by education, so I'm really sympathetic to a lot of this stuff. But I have concerns about localization, and two basic ones. The first one, over the last 12 years or so, I lived in two places, Georgia and then California, that had major droughts. Now, in that area, there was hardly any rain. But the price of food and our ability to get food hardly changed at all. And that's because we were automatically getting food from many places, from different parts of the country, from different parts of the world. So we were buffered against those droughts. Now, how do you get that kind of resilience in a localized system? And number two, as long as we don't have a world federation yet, if there is evidence that international trade promotes peace, so how do we keep that benefit?
So Hazel? Oh, you're muted, Hazel.
I'm really sorry, but I was unable to hear most of that. If you could summarize that for me, Arthur.
Melanie, can you? I was also having trouble hearing it. Could you catch it,
All
Melanie?
right, Jane. Yeah. So basically, if you have, she was doing the example of when there was a drought in California, and when there's droughts in a local economy, the price of food didn't go down because you were able to get our food.
It didn't go up.
Or the price didn't go up because there was, you know, the local economy. So how is it that you can make this local economy work when, you know, that's such a benefit? You can get food from other places when you're in a drought situation. Is that what you said, Jane?
Yes, that kind of example, yes.
Okay.
Well, I would just say that speaking generally, as our human societies have evolved and our technologies evolved, we now are well into the information age, and our communication tools are so much better than they ever have been before. Just witness what we're all doing right now, that we can exchange knowledge and most of the advanced economies today and most of the corporations that are based on these kind of technologies are now about 80% of the wealth that is produced in these societies. It's no longer stuff that you can drop on your foot. It's now brands, advertising, beautiful documentary films like the one that you all did on Gary Davis. It's education, it's exchange of ideas, it's scientific professional communities. And all of this now is based in communications. So that's the big difference.
Does that answer your question, Jane? So she had two questions. So Jane, did that answer your question, or did you have a
not the first one, maybe a little bit about the second one, about peace.
Okay.
But you can't eat documentaries.
What was the first one?
So basically, she said you answered her second question, but the first one was basically, so there's a drought, we have a local economy and you get food really locally, and then there's a drought, there's no food, so people are starving, but that's not the case right now because people can get food from other sources. So how would that work if we're working in just everybody's local and the prices of food stay the same, even though locally there's a drought and the prices should go up? So that was her first question.
Okay, I see the point. And there again, when you look at what's happening in terms of climate change right now, where the planet is teaching humans directly, you know, the planet is now our programmed learning environment. And what the planet is saying to humanity is you've got it all wrong. You've created a system which is destroying the earth, and you're going to destroy yourselves. That's what the planet's telling us. And basically, the planet is saying, how many times do I have to kick you in the ass? Is it fires? Is it drought? Is it floods? Is it enormous hurricanes? Is it pandemics? What does it take to get your attention that you're doing all the wrong things? And what we have found is that now with all of these disasters are the content of our daily communication system. And when the fires happened in Australia, firefighters came to Australia from all over the world to try to help. The same thing with the fires that destroyed the town in California. And so basically, we are also being taught that we are actually one human family and we are going to sink or swim together. Yep. So while we have it's quite right that right now we have a very unsustainable food system in the world. And I've written a lot about this the last 2 years, that the reason our food system is so perilous is that it's teetering on the world's 3% of fresh water, which is dwindling. And yet, this is the water planet. And 97% of the water on this planet happens to be salty. But guess what? Mother Nature created the other half of the food, the plant kingdom, salt-loving plants, otherwise known as halophytes. Halo, meaning salt, and phyte from the Greek, meaning love, salt-loving plants. And the ones people are most familiar with, which has made it into the supermarkets, is quinoa, the grain which grows wild on the salt flats around Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. But there's also China's salt-loving rice, which is very tasty and gets very high prices. There's Salicornia, otherwise known as sea asparagus, which gourmet chefs cook with around the world. And it grows everywhere, so no greedy capitalist can take it over and exploit it. And you can go out and pick it any place on earth. And there are about 100 of these very nutritious food plants, which I am working very hard with a group of scientists and people to promote that we have to add these into the human food system as quickly as we can, because guess what? They grow wild, and they have done for centuries in 22 countries on degraded and desert land, irrigated only with salt water. They don't need pesticides, they don't need fertilizers, they don't use antibiotics. And basically, guess what? Their roots, their very deep roots, capture more CO2 from the atmosphere even than old growth forests, because they grow so fast.
Wow.
And so, and they're also more nutritious for humans because they have exactly the right profile of minerals and they are complete proteins. So what's not to like? We've done 2 reports on this that you can read on our website, ethicalmarkets.com. And the only thing, there's 2 things holding it up. One is the big corporations that own all of the commodities, the 5 basically monocultured grains that are in the global commodity trading system. Corn, wheat, soybeans, alfalfa, rice, And they are very tightly controlling all of this together with the pesticide and manufacturers, the manufacturers of big machinery for big agriculture, and of course the meat producers, which we have to put out of business. And they, but in terms of people don't understand this because nobody's ever told them about it.
Right.
And even the scientists, we're having a hard time with the scientists, and that's to do with the cognitive bias that human beings have, which are pointed out by Daniel Kahneman in his wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And it's called theory-induced blindness.
Wow. Wow.
And we are overcoming that gradually. We have a television program you can watch that's playing right now on our homepage called Investing in Saltwater Agriculture, the next big thing.
That's very, very exciting. I'm very happy to hear about that. I definitely want the report. I want to see the show. I'd love to have we have a local estuary nearby that's pretty saline. I would love to see if we can get some saltwater crop stands that we could find and so on. You know, one of the things Gary talked about, and I think this also answers Jane's question, Gary talked about going global and local at the same time. I mean, Gary was a big advocate of, yes, we have to be world citizens because we have to create that umbrella of a people power planet that protects our diversity, that protects our different all the different indigenous groups and all the different things that create creativity and differences, that protects our diversity and difference. And we have to do globally the things we need to, like you just said, when Jane asked what happens, there's a drought in the area. Well, actually people all, if you become a world citizen and you have built into your app, you know, your systems, you begin to interactively help whenever there's need. People are already doing that around the world, helping when there's need, joining in, helping build local economies, doing microfinance where it's needed, whatever else. So we can begin to both localize and globalize at the same time. And that's the key to the solution. Yes. It's not just one. It's not go local and close out the world and forget them. And it's not go global and have everything all merged. It's that combination.
Yes. And the term that everybody uses for this is galocalization.
Right, local. That's what Gary said. Go local. Right. G-L-O-C-A-L. Right.
Yes, galocalization.
Exactly.
Yes. So there again, you see, Gary was right.
Yeah.
And so he was ahead of us all.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Gary coined it, but he picked it up very fast when he heard it and put it right into his talks and his program. Who else has a question? Anybody else with a question they want to jump in? Okay, let's start with Jerry and then Tom.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. Hazel, I had a question for you about unregulated capitalism. If you see that as the problem, it seems like the world has kind of shifted towards capitalism with, with the Soviet Union becoming more capitalistic in China. But it seems like the problem is really our capitalism is not regulated, meaning we allow people to pollute, we allow people to destroy the environment, overfish, drill for oil, that kind of thing. I wondered if you could speak to regulations and if you see regulations of capitalism as an answer.
I'm mute again, Hazel.
There we go. Yeah. Yes, I agree. And you see, the 20th century was all about these arguments about ideologies, capitalism versus socialism versus communism and all the rest of it. And where we come down at my company is that there's nothing wrong with markets. Human beings have been trading with each other and doing markets ever since we came out of the trees. And Karl Polanyi wrote a wonderful book about this, and he talked about the islanders in the Pacific, the Trobriand islanders, and they traveled for miles in canoes, and they were exchanging shells with each other. And then, Native Americans used the skin, wampum, skin of animals, and all of that. And so the thing is that when you have markets get too big beyond the local marketplaces are really the core of all local communities. I grew up in a small town like that. Everybody went to the village green, the total, the marketplace. We used to all go there and people would bring their goats and sheep and their produce and everything. But what went wrong was turning that into a massive system of accumulation and then judging it all by the measurement of money. And where you ended up with the financialization we have today, which is merely money making money out of money. That's the insanity that we're dealing with today. And so basically, we follow how markets have evolved. And markets are evolving all the time. And we had a lot of good evolution of markets until Donald Trump came into office. And he's been dismantling regulations right, left, and center because of the oligarchs, you know, and the white supremacists who support him. I know we're going to throw him out in a few months. I don't think there's any doubt about it, because he's screwing up so badly every time you look, you know, that I can't imagine. I expect him actually to resign long before November. But basically, we have to have government regulation. See, one of the things that happened in the United States, which Hillary Clinton talked about many years ago, was the vast right-wing conspiracy. And there actually was one. And it was all of the oligarchs who'd made a tremendous amount of money on Wall Street, making money out of money, you know. And then they started backing politicians with money. And then they set up economic think tanks like Cato, and they put economics departments into all the universities to promote this economic model. And one way and another, they ended up, of course, with supporting Donald Trump. And I think that even some of them are going to move away from him now. But basically, they brainwashed everybody, but beginning with Reagan, that somehow government bad, private enterprise good. And, you know, I mean, now we suddenly realize with this pandemic, hey, you know, we need some kind of leadership. We are the United States of America, and we need government leadership. And of course,
Wonderful.
we need regulations.
Wonderful.
So we're rethinking that now.
Thank you. Well, since we're running short of time, I have two more questions I want to make sure we get in. First, we have Tom, and then we have Robin. Tom, do you want to go ahead? Do you have a question you go with first?
Yeah, thank you. Well, you know, this is another answer for Jane. And Hazel did touch on the saltwater farming, which is another way that I was going to mention about how to get the vegetables and all the produce back to the local communities. The thing that I wanted to mention is that science is already there for the desalination of salt water. And what I predict, which scientists already have predicted, is in the future, they will turn our deserts into gardens with huge desalination plants and funneling the water through conduits, or you know, however they get it over the mountains, you know, whatever, but that they're actually gonna, those local communities that Jane talked about that were in droughts will no longer be in droughts, that the desalination of the salt water is in our future. Okay.
Good.
Well, could I respond to that? We did a study of desalination in our last Green Transition Scoreboard, which is on our website. And there's 16,000 desalination plants around the world right now. And unfortunately, they are extremely energy intensive. And even if they were operated on solar energy, which they're not, they basically create so much brine where they pull the salt out of the water and then they dump it in the ocean. Most of them are on the coasts around the world. And that kills the the life in the oceans. And so what we found, and you can look at our research because we went into this great detail. And basically we found that the salt-loving plants not only restore soil, but also bring rainfall. And you can green deserts. In fact, we have a paper on desert greening where you only use salt water to irrigate deserts by growing the salt-loving plants. And you see what the salt-loving plants do is they collect the salt in their roots, which is why they're good to eat, because you're not eating it in the leaves, and it's all collected in the roots. And then you can use the roots because salt is very useful, but they take it out of the soil the way nature would do it. And you see, human beings are incredibly clever, and they come up with all of these incredible, great ideas, of which desalination is one. And there is a purpose for some desalination if it were done with solar energy, and if they figured out what to do with the brine so that the brine gets dried and used as molten salt for solar farms. You know, a lot of solar farms use molten salt as batteries to collect the solar electricity. So there's all kinds of uses for the salt. But right now, the 16,000 of these desalination plants are just dumping the salt into the ocean. Wow. And destroying all of the life in the oceans.
Well, you know, that's so exciting hearing you say that, these alternatives. And one of the things Gary would talk about, what an incredibly ingenious species we are if we just make some shifts in the system and in our thinking so that we can unleash the great creativity of humanity and get that to be what leads. We have a question from Robin now, who knew Gary, well, very close to Gary for many, many years. Robin, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, hi, thanks. Hello, Hazel. Yes,
hi.
I was a friend of Gary's for a while, and
long time.
and I keep wondering today, what would he be saying about the crises we're facing? I am presently very involved with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and we're involved in a sort of history project. It's 75 years since the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but 75 years since the United Nations was formed, and that we are still dealing with these two paths that we could take, the path of cooperation and democracy, and of, you know, force and domination. So my question is, what do you think about the Secretary General's proposal for a global ceasefire? It seems to be getting traction in some ways. I'm just wondering whether you see it even growing. And, you know, the United Nations always gets together in September. Is it possible there could be a critical mass of countries saying, hey, we're going to give up this killing stuff. We have to deal with the pandemic. Is that, do you think that's possibly where we're heading?
I was so happy when he pronounced that whole idea of a ceasefire, because any opportunity that leaders have to point out the absurdity of all the money that goes into killing each other, which should go into all of the wonderful creative things that we can do to make this planet more of a paradise. And so I'm glad that he did that. It was the right thing to do. Incidentally, Elise Boulding, you must have known Elise Boulding. who is a dear friend of mine,
Wonderful.
and
Wonderful
in the
person.
Women's League for Peace and Freedom. And I just love Elise very much. And I think that women are really coming forward all over the world. We're just saying, you know, come on. We're the ones that invest most of our time and energy in producing the next generation. And we don't want them to be used as cannon fodder anymore, you know. I'm just so thrilled with the emergence of Greta Thunberg and all of these young people. I mean, this is simple stuff, isn't it? It's so simple. And so I just hope he keeps at that, and I hope we all support him. And I'm involved in a conference coming up in October with the World Academy of Art and Science and the United Nations and UNCTAD on global leadership in the 21st century. And we're putting together this new model of leadership, which is basically no more old white guy on a white horse. We've had that, you know. And this is about networked leadership from the grassroots. And we have found all of these women leaders who don't require any adulation or credit. They just do what they know needs to be done. And so it'll be a virtual meeting now, but it will be a lot of women, young and old, coming to the fore and showing how network leadership can actually help change the world.
Wow, network leadership from the ground up. That's what Gary's People-Powered Planet was all
That's
about.
what it was,
It's our essential point of this show. And I think you're showing our film at that conference. Is that the one? Are you showing it at that conference?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. Well, we're so pleased. We've come to the end of our official hour. We can still chat a little on if some people want to carry on or have other questions. But I think it was terrifically important to have this fantastic discussion with you. And I thank you so much and thank everyone who's here. So let's unmute it and give Hazel a big round of applause.
Well, thank you all. Such a pleasure.
And don't forget to go to ethicalmarkets.com and read her books, do everything. She's amazing. Oh my God, I'm so lucky.
It's all free. Yes.
Woo-hoo! Yay. Thank you, Hazel. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everyone who has to go ahead and go. I'm going to do the theme music. And then after that, if anybody's left, we'll still talk. Martha will still talk with you. But also remember, if you're not a member yet, it's 2 months free. So you can easily become a member at our club page. It's The World is My Country /club.
And let everyone else know about our club. We need everybody's help in getting word out about this and about our new movie, We Are One. It's a compilation movie with the little shorts about Gary and some commentary, and it's a new thing we put out free on YouTube. We want all of you to help get a lot of people to like it, join our YouTube channel, and to a shortcut to kind of get to the website where we show where it is just to go to, it's called We Are One, so go to onefilms.com, and that's just a shortcut to take you onto our website, theworldismycountry.com, the page about the new movie.